5 riders came up the wagon road with a paper that said the land was no longer hers.
Mrs. Ballinger, you have got until Thursday.
The widow stood on her porch with her husband's shotgun and did not move.
My husband put every post in that fence. You will not take it on a Thursday or any other day.
What none of the 5 men knew was that a stranger had been sleeping in her barn for 4 nights. He was sick, he was armed, and he had no reason on earth to help her. But when he saw what was hanging on a nail by her kitchen door, he stopped breathing, and what he did next would change everything. The wind came off the flats and pushed against the little house until the window glass rattled in its frame. Ruth Ballinger sat at the kitchen table and counted her money. She counted it the way she counted everything, in her husband's careful hand, entered in a column in a ledger she kept beside the sugar tin, $11.40, 2 Mexican coins that the bank in Pryor's Bend would not take, a silver dollar from 1879 that she had promised herself she would not spend. It was the second week of October in 1884. The corn had come in thin, the creek had run low all summer, and the grass on the north quarter had cured to the color of old rope. Ruth was 34 years old. She had a straight back and hands that had gone hard across the knuckles. Her hair was pinned up tight because there was no time in a day for it to be anything else. In the corner by the stove, her daughter Nell sat cross-legged on the floor with a slate across her knees. Nell was 10. She was copying figures out of the ledger, 1 column at a time, the way her mother had taught her. Her tongue was pushed into the corner of her mouth. "Ma," Nell said, "is a knot with a line through it still a knot?" "It is a knot that somebody wanted you to be sure about," Ruth said. Nell nodded and made another one. Ruth looked at the door. There was a paper nailed to it. It had been there since Monday. It was a good paper, thick and cream-colored, printed at the top with the words Calloway Land and Cattle Company in letters half an inch high. She had read it 11 times. She could have recited it in her sleep. It said the Ballinger quarter section had reverted. It said the original patent was clouded. It said Calloway Land and Cattle held the superior claim and would take possession on the 16th day of October, 9 days. Ruth stood up and walked to the door and looked at the paper again, because looking at it was the only thing she could think to do with her hands. Beside the door, on a square-cut nail that Amos had driven into the frame the first month they lived there, hung a canteen. It was tin, covered in wool that had gone gray. It had a dent in the side the size of a thumb. Along the seam somebody had punched letters into the metal with a nail set, 1 strike at a time. A. Ballinger, 7 Cass. Ruth touched it as she went past. She did that every time she went past. She had stopped noticing that she did it. Amos Ballinger had been a lieutenant in the 7th Kansas Cavalry. He had come back from the war with a powder burn across the bridge of his nose that never entirely faded, and eyes that watered in bright light and could not hold small print for more than a minute at a time. He had been sheriff of Pryor's Bend for 11 years. He had been dead for 2. There was no story in how he died. He had gone out on a January night to bring in a man who had been drinking, and he had brought him in, and 8 days later the pneumonia took him. That was all. No gunfight, no last words worth carving, just a hard cough, and then a quieter one, and then nothing at all. Ruth had buried him in the churchyard, on the rise behind the Lutheran church, where the ground froze so hard they had to build a fire on it first. She had not cried at the burial. She had cried in March, splitting wood, for no reason she could name. "Ma," Nell said, "there's a horse." Ruth turned. Out past the barn, where the wagon road came up through the cut in the low hills, a rider had appeared. Then another. Then 3 more, 5 men, riding easy, coming up her road in the flat gold light of 5 in the afternoon. Ruth reached behind the door and took down the shotgun. "Nell," she said, "inside, under the table. Do not come out until I say your whole name." Nell went. She did not argue. Amos's daughter had never once argued about a thing like that. Ruth stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door shut behind her. They came up and stopped in the yard in a loose half circle, the way men do when they have practiced it without ever calling it practice. The one in front was heavy through the shoulders and wore a good coat. His name was Dunnigan, and he was Barrett Calloway's foreman, and Ruth had known him for 9 years. which made what he was doing worse and not better. "Afternoon, Mrs. Ballinger," Dunnigan said. "Mr. Dunnigan, you get the notice? I got it Monday. It is still on my door. You are welcome to come read it if you have forgotten what it says." One of the men behind Dunnigan laughed, then thought better of it. Dunnigan took off his hat, which Ruth understood was meant to be a courtesy, and which she found she could not accept as one. "Mr. Calloway sent me out to say it plain, ma'am, so there's no confusion come Thursday. The company's taking the quarter. Now he don't want any trouble, and he don't want a woman and a child sleeping in a wagon. He'll pay $200 for the improvements. House, barn, fence, the whole of it. That's a good deal more than he has to pay, and he knows it, and he's doing it anyway." $200, Ruth said. "Yes, ma'am. My husband set every post in that fence himself. It took him one summer and part of another. He hauled the hearthstones up from the creek on a stone boat with one mule." She shifted the shotgun so it lay across her forearm. $200. "Mrs. Ballinger, how much is the north quarter worth to Mr. Calloway, Mr. Dunnigan?" Dunnigan's jaw moved. "That ain't for me to say." "Then I will say it. It is worth the creek. It is the only live water between here and the Kettleman Ridge, and Mr. Calloway has bought every section around it, and now he's got a paper that says a patent signed by the United States government in 1871 is clouded." Ruth looked at him steadily. "Do you know what clouded means, Mr. Dunnigan?" "No, ma'am." "Neither do I, and I have read a great many county papers." The wind came across the yard and moved the dust in a long, slow curl. Dunnigan put his hat back on. "Thursday, ma'am," he said. "There'll be more than 5 of us. I'd take the 200. He turned his horse. The riders went back down the wagon road the way they had come, and Ruth stood on the porch with the shotgun until they were through the cut and out of sight, and then a while longer, and then she found that her hands had started to shake, and she went inside and sat down before Nell could see it. She found him that night. She had gone out at full dark to see to the milk cow, because the cow did not care about Calloway land and cattle, and there was a strange mercy in that. The lantern threw its circle ahead of her across the packed dirt. She heard the cow shift. She heard the barn owl go out through the gap under the ridge beam. Then she heard a man cough. Ruth set the lantern down very slowly on the top of the grain barrel and picked up the pitchfork that leaned by the door. "Come out of there," she said. "Nothing. I have got a fork, and I have got a shotgun on the porch, and I will use the one to make you need the other. Come out." Hay moved in the far stall. A man sat up. He was old, or he looked it, 50, maybe more. Gray had come into his beard in 2 streaks along the jaw. His coat had been a good coat once, and had been rained on more times than it had been brushed. There was a gun belt on the hay beside him, and he did not reach for it, which Ruth noticed and did not entirely believe. "Ma'am," he said. Then he coughed, and it went on for a while, and it came up out of the bottom of his chest and made a wet sound at the end of it that Ruth knew. She had heard that sound in a bedroom in this house for 8 days in January 2 years ago. She stood with the pitchfork and listened to it, and something in her went cold and strange. "How long have you been in my barn?" 4 nights. He wiped his mouth with the back of his wrist. "I'd have asked. I come up the road the first night, and there was a light on and a woman alone in the house, and I judged that a man knocking at that hour would frighten you worse than a man in the barn would. Maybe I judged wrong." "You did." "Yes, ma'am, I'd say I did." "Stand up." He stood. It took him 2 tries. When he was up, he had to put a hand on the stall post. "What is your name?" "Wade Sturgis." "Where are you going, Mr. Sturgis?" He looked at her for a moment. "I have been asking myself that since about 1869, he said. "I have not landed on an answer that satisfies anybody." Ruth did not lower the pitchfork, but she had seen the way he stood, and she had seen the color of his face in the lantern light, which was the color of the underside of a mushroom, and she had heard the cough. "Have you eaten?" "I've had water." "That is not what I asked." Wade Sturgis was quiet. "No, ma'am," he said, "not since Tuesday." Ruth stood there in her own barn at 10 o'clock at night with a sick-armed stranger in front of her, and 9 days to keep her house, and she thought about what Amos would have done, and she was angry at how quickly she knew. "Leave the gun belt on the hay," she said. You may come as far as the porch. I will bring the plate out to you. If you come past the porch, I will shoot you, and I will not feel poorly about it in the morning. That's fair, Wade said. It is more than fair. Yes, ma'am, he said. It is. He ate on the porch step with the plate on his knees, and he ate slowly, which told her more than anything else had. Nell watched him through the window until Ruth sent her to bed twice. In the morning, Ruth found the plate washed and set upside down on the rail with the fork laid across it, and Wade Sturgis standing at the corner of the barn with his hat in his hand, waiting to be told to go. That hinge on your barn door is dropped, he said. It'll tear out the post by spring. It is a 20-minute job if you have got a bit and a peg. I did not ask you to look at my hinges. No, ma'am. Can you do it in a day? I can do it in 20 minutes. Then do it in a day, Ruth said, and you may sleep in the barn a second week, and I will feed you twice, and then you will go. He looked at her. Why? Because you have got the same cough my husband had, and he died of it in 8 days, Ruth said, and I am not going to have you die in my barn during the 1 week I have left to keep my barn. She turned and went inside and shut the door harder than she needed to. It was the third afternoon when it happened. He had done the hinge in 20 minutes, and then he had done the gate latch, and then the loose board on the porch, and Ruth had stopped pretending she did not want the work done. He came to the kitchen door to bring back the auger. Ruth was at the stove. Nell was at the table with the slate. Wade Sturgis stepped up into the doorway and put the auger down on the shelf where she had told him to put it, and then he did not move. Ruth turned around. He was looking at the wall beside the door. He was looking at the canteen. His face had gone entirely still, not pale. He'd been pale for a week, but still, the way water goes still. Mr. Sturgis. He did not seem to hear her. He reached up. His hand was not steady. He turned the canteen on its nail so the seam came around into the light, and he put his thumb on the punched letters and read them the way a man reads something he already knows. Where did you get this canteen? He said. His voice had gone strange. It was my husband's. Wade Sturgis turned and looked at her. Ballinger, he said. 7th Kansas. Amos Ballinger. Yes. Where is he? He is in the churchyard behind the Lutheran church, Ruth said. He has been there 2 years in January. The man put his hand flat on the door frame. Then he sat down on the step in the doorway, all at once, the way a man sits when his legs have simply stopped agreeing to the arrangement. Ma, Nell said. Hush, Nell. Wade Sturgis sat in the doorway of a kitchen in Pryor's Bend with his hat in his 2 hands, and he did not say anything for a long time. When he spoke, he did not look up. I was 19, he said. I want to say that first, because when I tell it, you are going to think I was a coward, and I was, and I would rather say it before you have to. Ruth pulled out the chair opposite the door and sat down in it. There is a place in the Missouri line country called Farron's Cut, Wade said. It is a road through a limestone shelf. It is maybe 200 yards long, and it is narrow enough that 2 wagons cannot pass. In the fall of '63, we had 4 ambulance wagons in that cut, and better than 40 men in them, and the rebels come around onto the shelf above us and close the far end. He turned the hat in his hands. I was on the mule at the head of the 2nd wagon. I was supposed to drive, and I did not drive, ma'am. I got down off that mule, and I got underneath the wagon, and I put my arms over my head, and I stayed there, and I would like to tell you I was hit, and I was not. I was 19 years old, and I quit. The stove ticked. There was a lieutenant come up the cut on a gray horse, Wade said. He had about a dozen men, and no reason at all to think it would work. He took them up the shelf on the north side where there wasn't but a goat track, and he got in behind those guns, and he held that shelf for, I do not know. It felt like an hour. It was probably 11 minutes, long enough for the wagons to get through. He looked at the floor. He come back down the cut after, and he found me under that wagon, and I have thought about what he said to me every day for 21 years. Ruth did not ask. She waited. He said, Son, get up on the mule. Wade's mouth moved. That was all. He did not put me on report. He did not tell a living soul. He got me up on that mule, and he put the lines in my hands, and he rode alongside me the rest of the way out, and he talked to me about nothing at all the whole way. The price of hogs, I think, so that I would have something to hold on to that was not what I had just done. He finally raised his head. I never learned his name that day. I was too ashamed to ask. I learned it 4 years later from a man in Sedalia who had been in the 3rd wagon. He nodded at the wall. A. Ballinger, 7th Kansas. Ruth found that she had put her hand flat on the table. I have been coming here for a long while, ma'am, Wade Sturgis said. Not straight. I am not going to stand in your kitchen and tell you I have been riding steady toward Pryor's Bend for 21 years, because that would be a lie, and I have told enough of those. But I have been coming. Every time I got a stake together, I would think, this year I will go find him, and I will say the thing. And every year I would find a reason that it was not the year. He stood up. He had to use the frame to do it. And now I am in his barn, he said, and he is on the hill. Ruth got up and went to the stove and moved the coffee pot to the back of it, because her eyes had gone hot, and she was not going to do that in front of a stranger. He never spoke about the war, she said, with her back to him. Not one time in 15 years. I asked him once when we were courting. He said it was a great deal of walking. That sounds like him. You do not know a thing about him. No, ma'am, Wade said. I know one thing about him. I know he come up a goat track in daylight for 40 men he did not know, and then he come back down it for one that wasn't worth it. Ruth stood with her hand on the coffee pot. There is a paper nailed to my front door, she said. Did you read it? I did. Then you know we lose this place on Thursday. I know somebody says so. Ruth turned around. Wade Sturgis had put his hat on. Ma'am, he said, I would take it kindly if you would let me stay through Thursday. Word got to town by Friday, the way it does. Ruth drove the buckboard in for coffee and lamp oil and to stand in front of the land office one more time. And when she came into the mercantile, Mrs. Vosburgh looked up from the counter and looked back down again in a particular way. Mrs. Ballinger, Mrs. Vosburgh, a pound of coffee and the oil. Mrs. Vosburgh got the coffee. She was a narrow woman with a narrow mouth, and she had run the mercantile in Pryor's Bend for 22 years, and had opinions about most of it. They say you have got a man out at your place. I have got a hired man. Hired with what, dear? Ruth put her money on the counter and counted it out, and did not look up. With supper, she said. Well, Mrs. Vosburgh wrapped the coffee. It is not for me to say, but a woman alone, and a child in the house, and a stranger nobody in this town has laid eyes on before, and the man is armed. Ruth. Tucker saw the belt on him. She pushed the parcel across. There are people who would say a widow ought to be careful of how a thing looks. There are, Ruth agreed. I only mean, there are also people, Ruth said, who have watched a company from Wichita nail a paper to my door, and who have not come out the road to see about it, and who have found the time to be careful of how I look. She picked up her parcel. Behind her, from the barrel by the stove, Dunnigan said, Mrs. Ballinger. Ruth turned. He was sitting with his coat open and a cup in his hand. He did not stand up. Thursday's coming, he said. I am aware of the days of the week, Mr. Dunnigan. 200's still there. It won't be Friday. He blew across the cup. You want to think about the girl. Wagon's a cold place in October. Ruth looked at him for a moment. Your father homesteaded the Sawtooth place, she said. My husband rode out in 78 when the Neely brothers came at him over that water, and he stood in the yard all night with a lantern so your father could sleep. Do you remember that? Dunnigan looked into his cup. That ain't the same thing, he said. No, Ruth said. It is not. She went out. That night, Ruth got out the boxes. There were 9 of them, wooden, stacked in the little room off the kitchen that Amos had called the office, and that everyone else in the county had called something funnier. Because here was the thing about Amos Ballinger. He could not read small print for more than a minute at a time. The powder burn had taken something out of his eyes at Farron's Cut, and it never came back. He could ride. He could shoot. He could look at a man and know whether he was lying. He could not sit down with a column of figures and a deed description and keep his eyes on it. So Ruth had done it. For 11 years, she'd been the sheriff's hand. She wrote his reports. She copied his warrants. She kept the county's filings in a fair round script because the county clerk drank. And when the clerk got worse, she began keeping a second copy of everything that came through the office, in her own boxes, in her own house, on her own paper. The town had a name for it. The town had several. They called her the Lady Sheriff. They said Amos Ballinger had married a filing cabinet. Mrs. Vosburgh had once said, in a voice meant to be overheard, that it was an unnatural way for a woman to spend an evening. Ruth had heard all of it. She'd kept the second copy anyway. She lit the lamp and put it on the floor and knelt down and started going through 1871. Wade came to the door at midnight and looked in and did not say anything and went away and came back at 1 with coffee and set it on the floor beside her and went away again. At 2 in the morning she found it. It was a survey plat, folded in eighths, soft at the creases. Ruth opened it on the floor and put the lamp beside it and read it 3 times. Then she sat back on her heels. The Calloway claim rested on a deed that had been recorded, the notice said, in the Pryor's Bend land office in April of 1871. But the land office in Pryor's Bend had burned in March of 1871. Ruth knew that, because in her own hand, on a sheet of foolscap dated the 9th of April, 1871, she had copied out the temporary filing schedule that the territorial surveyor had posted after the fire, the one that said no instrument could be recorded in the county until the office reopened in September. There was no record in April. There could not have been a record in April. Somebody had written a date on a piece of paper and counted on the fact that everything which would prove otherwise had burned. Ruth put both hands flat on the floor and breathed. Everything that would prove otherwise had burned, except that she had kept the second copy. She drove in Monday morning with the plat wrapped in oilcloth inside her coat, and she went to Judge Merriweather's office above the bank and laid it on his desk and made him read it twice. He read it twice. He took off his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose for a long moment. "Ruth," he said, "where is the original of this schedule?" "In the county book, volume 4. "Then that is what a court will want, not your copy, the book." "Then send for the book." "I will send for the book," Judge Merriweather said. "I will wire the territorial recorder this afternoon, and I will have a man bring volume 4 up from Hallam Station on Wednesday's train. And Ruth," he put his spectacles back on, "do not tell one soul in this town what you have found. Not one." She told no one. It did not matter. The county record annex behind the courthouse burned Tuesday night. It went up at about 2 in the morning, and it took the whole back wall of the courthouse with it. And by the time the bucket line got organized, there was nothing in there but ash and warped tin. They found a coal oil can in the alley. Nobody found anything else. Ruth heard the bell from 4 miles out and stood on her porch in the dark and watched the glow on the underside of the clouds to the west and knew exactly what it was before anybody told her. Wade came out from the barn and stood at the bottom of the steps. "That's the courthouse," he said. "It is the annex behind it." "What's in the annex?" "Volumes 1 through 9 of the county record," Ruth said. "Everything filed in this county since 1868. Wade Sturgis looked at the glow for a while. "Ma'am," he said, "did you tell anybody what you found in those boxes?" "I told Judge Merriweather, in his office, with the door shut." "Above the bank." Ruth turned her head. "Above the bank," she said slowly. "Who else is in that building?" "The Calloway Land and Cattle Company keeps a room on the ground floor." Neither of them said anything for a moment. "They burned the county's book," Ruth said. "They burned the book they knew about," Wade said. And Ruth Ballinger stood on her own porch at 2 in the morning and started, for the first time in 9 days, to laugh. One hard breath of it, with no humor in it at all. "Mr. Sturgis," she said, "I have got 9 boxes in that room." Wade Sturgis left before daylight on Wednesday, on Ruth's saddle horse with a folded paper in his coat, and 40 miles of road ahead of him, and a cough that had not improved. Ruth had argued. She had argued hard. "You will not make it to Hallam Station and back." "I do not have to make it back," Wade said, tightening the cinch. "I only have to make it there. There is a man in Pryor's Bend who could ride it in half the time." "Name him." Ruth stood in the cold yard and could not name one. That was the whole of it. and they both knew it. She had lived in that county for 15 years. She had written every warrant that had kept it honest, and when she stood in her yard at 4 in the morning and tried to think of one man who would ride to Hallam Station for the sheriff's widow against Barrett Calloway, she could not do it. "Ma'am," Wade said. He got up on the horse, and it cost him something to do it. 21 years ago, a man rode up a goat track for 40 fellows he'd never met. He looked down at her. "This is a road," he said, "and I know you." He went down the wagon road in the dark. Ruth spent Wednesday moving boxes. She and Nell carried all 9 of them out of the office and down into the root cellar and stacked them behind the potato bins. And then Ruth went back up and took her own house apart. Every drawer open, every paper on the floor. The office stripped to bare shelves, so that anyone who came through that door in the night would find a room that had already been emptied and would waste no time looking for a cellar. "Ma," Nell said, from the top of the cellar steps, "are they going to come in the house?" Ruth stood in the lamplight with her arms full of paper. "I do not know," she said. "You always say a true answer, even when it is a bad one." "That is right. Papa did that too." Ruth set the papers down. "Nell," she said, "come here." The girl came down the steps. Ruth crouched so they were the same height, which took some doing on the cellar stair. "You know what I have got in these boxes?" "Papers." "Copies," Ruth said. "Second copies, every one of them written out twice by hand, once for the county and once for me. Do you know that people in this town have laughed at me for that for 11 years? Mrs. Vosburgh says it is unnatural. Mrs. Vosburgh has said that in my hearing." Ruth agreed. "And I want you to remember this next part for a long time, because it will not come up often, and when it does it will matter." She put a hand on the top box. "They burned the county's book Tuesday night," Ruth said. "There is not a court in this territory that can prove one word about this land now, except that a woman in a kitchen in Pryor's Bend was too stubborn to stop copying things twice." Nell looked at the boxes. "So the unnatural thing is the thing that works," she said. "Yes," Ruth said. "Write that on your slate. They came at 9 in the morning, and Dunnigan had not lied. There were 11. Barrett Calloway came with them, in a buggy, in a gray coat, with a lap robe over his knees and a leather case on the seat beside him. He was a small, neat man of about 60, and he had the mildest face Ruth had ever seen on a person. The buggy stopped in the yard. The riders spread out behind it. Ruth came out onto the porch. She did not bring the shotgun. She brought a chair. She set it down and sat in it and folded her hands. Calloway looked at that for a moment. "Mrs. Ballinger, Mr. Calloway, I am sorry to have to come out here in person. I doubt that considerably, but go on." Calloway's mouth moved slightly. He opened the leather case. "The company takes possession this morning. I have brought the $200 in cash. I have also brought a wagon, which is behind us on the road, and 2 men who will load whatever you want to take, at the company's expense. I am not required to do any of that. You are not. I would like the record to show that I did." "The record," Ruth said, "burned Tuesday night." The yard went very quiet. Calloway did not blink. He did not look away. He was, Ruth thought, quite a good hand at this. "That was a great misfortune for the county," he said. "It was a great convenience for your deed. Mrs. Ballinger, your deed says it was recorded in the Pryor's Bend Land Office in April of 1871, Ruth said. "The land office burned in March of 1871 and did not reopen until September. Nothing was recorded in this county in April of that year. Nothing could have been." Calloway sat with his hands on the leather case. "That is an interesting theory," he said. "Can you prove it?" "Yes." "With what?" And Ruth Ballinger heard, far off down the wagon road, coming up through the cut, the sound of more than one horse. There were 4 of them. Marshal Ambrose Danforth of the Territorial District came up the road first on a bay, and behind him rode Judge Merriweather, badly, on a borrowed animal, and behind him came a young clerk from Hallam Station with a strapped canvas satchel across his back, and behind all of them, at a walk, barely on the horse at all, came Wade Sturgis, Half of Pryor's Bend came up the road behind them on foot and in wagons, because a marshal riding through town at 9 in the morning is a thing that people follow. Danforth stopped in the yard and looked at 11 mounted men and a buggy and a woman sitting in a chair on a porch. "Mr. Calloway," he said. "Marshal, I'm told there's a question about a date." The clerk got down and unstrapped the satchel and brought out Volume 4 of the county record, the territorial recorder's certified duplicate, which had lived in a vault in Hallam Station since 1873, and which no one in Pryor's Bend had thought about in 11 years. Judge Merriweather opened it on the seat of the buggy. He found the page. He read it out loud so the road could hear it. The temporary filing schedule of the 9th of April, 1871, posted by the territorial surveyor after the fire, suspending all recording in the county until the office reopened in September. Then he closed the book. "Barrett," he said, "your deed is dated in a month when this county could not record a deed." Calloway did not move. "And there is a woman on that porch," Judge Merriweather said, "who has had a copy of that schedule, in her own hand, in a box in her house, since the year I was elected." It was then that Doc Josiah Rennick came out of the crowd. He was 71 years old, and he had set most of the bones in that county, and he walked with a stick. He came out into the middle of the yard and stood there, and people got quiet, because Doc Rennick did not do things like that. He was looking at Wade Sturgis on the horse. "Son," he said, "say your name." Wade lifted his head. "Wade Sturgis. Where were you in the fall of '63? Wade did not answer. "I will answer it," Doc Rennick said. He turned around. He turned all the way around, so that he was speaking to the road and the wagons and Mrs. Vosburgh and Dunnigan and every soul who had walked out from Pryor's Bend that morning to watch a widow lose her house. "I was a hospital steward in the 3rd ambulance wagon at a place called Farron's Cut," Doc Rennick said. "There were 43 of us in those wagons, and the road was shut at both ends, and I was 26 years old, and I had already made my peace with dying that afternoon." He put both hands on his stick. "A lieutenant of the 7th Kansas took a dozen men up a goat track and got in behind the guns and held that shelf long enough for 4 wagons to get out. I did not know his name for 11 years. I learned it when he pinned on a star in this town, and I looked at his face across a table in the Elkhorn, and I had to go outside." The wind moved across the yard. "Amos Ballinger is on that hill behind the Lutheran church," Doc Rennick said, "and I am standing in his yard, and there are 11 men on horses here to take his house from his wife." Nobody said anything at all. 43 of us came out of that cut," Doc Rennick said. "There are 4 still living in this county. Their names are on that church roll, and every one of you knows them." He turned his head and looked at Dunnigan. "Your father was in the 4th wagon, Tom." Dunnigan sat on his horse and looked at his hands. "I did not know that," he said. "No," Doc Rennick said. "He never told you. None of them ever told anybody. That is what makes it our debt and not theirs." He looked up at Ruth on the porch. "Ma'am," he said, "I have been in this county 18 years, and I never once came out this road to ask if you needed anything. I would like that entered somewhere, because I do not intend to forget it." Marshal Danforth turned his horse and looked at the 11 riders. "Gentlemen," he said, "go home." They went. Dunnigan went last. He stopped his horse at the foot of the porch steps and took off his hat and held it, and he could not look at her, and he said, "Mrs. Ballinger, I have got no words that will do." "Then do not use any," Ruth said. "Come back Saturday and help me get the hay in." Dunnigan put his hat on. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Barrett Calloway was indicted in Hallam Station in February on 4 counts of filing a false instrument and 1 count of arson, and the arson did not stick, and the other 4 did, and the Calloway Land and Cattle Company was broken up and sold at auction the following autumn. 11 quarter sections in that county went back to the families who had been pushed off them. Every one of those cases was proved out of 9 wooden boxes in a root cellar in Pryor's Bend. Ruth Ballinger was appointed county recorder in March. She was the first woman to hold a county office in the territory, and the territorial recorder in Hallam Station wrote her a letter about it that she never answered and never threw away. They built the new annex behind the courthouse in the spring. Dunnigan hauled the stone. Mrs. Vosburgh sent a woman out with curtains for the office windows, and did not come herself, and did not sign the note. And Ruth hung the curtains and never said a word about it, which was its own kind of answer. There is a plate on the wall inside that annex. It is brass, and it is not large, and it says, Ballinger County Record, 7KS. Wade Sturgis did not last the winter. The lung took him in the second week of January, in the small room off the kitchen that Amos had called the office. Doc Rennick came out 3 times, and the third time he came out, he did not bring the bag. Ruth sat up with him the last 2 nights. Nell brought the water. Near the end, he was mostly not there, but once in a while he came back for a minute at a time, and on the last of those he looked at the wall by the door where the lamp was, and he said, "Ma'am, is that the canteen?" "It is on the nail," Ruth said. "It is where it has always been. Would you turn it so I can see the letters?" She turned it. He looked at it for a while. "He rode alongside me the whole way out," Wade Sturgis said, "and he talked about hogs. They buried him on the rise behind the Lutheran church, 11 feet from Amos Ballinger, and Doc Rennick paid for the stone, and would not discuss it with anybody. Ruth had them cut 4 words under the name. He came back for it. The next spring, Nell Ballinger sat at the big desk in the new annex on a Saturday morning with the county book open in front of her and a pen in her hand, copying a filing out in a fair round script. She did it twice. Once for the book and once for the box. Her mother had explained about that. Ruth stood in the doorway with a cup of coffee and watched her daughter's hand move down the page. And out the window, the wagon road came up through the cut in the low hills the way it always had. And there was nobody on it, and that was all right too. Amos Ballinger had ridden up a goat track in daylight for 40 men he never met. 21 years later, one of those men rode 40 miles with a bad lung to a station he had never seen, for a woman he had known 11 days. And in between, for 11 years, a woman that a whole town laughed at had sat at a kitchen table every evening and copied things out twice. None of it looked like much at the time. That is generally the way of it, and that is where we will leave Ruth and Nell and the little place at Pryor's Bend. I hope this story gave you a quiet hour away from the noise of the day. I always wonder how you spend this time with me. Perhaps you were driving a long stretch of road, or washing up after supper, or sitting somewhere warm with the lamp low. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and I would truly love to know what country you are watching from. It always amazes me how far these stories travel. If you would like to ride along on the next one, a like and a subscribe mean more than you know. Thank you for spending this time with me.